Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of Coffee and Open Source. I'm really excited for my guest today. We're going to talk about all sorts of things in the open source and tech communities. So let's just get started. My guest today is Nitya. Nitya, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself? Oh, that's great. I first off, you know that I'm a huge fan of the stuff that you do with Sketch the Docs. I think it's absolutely brilliant. When we both worked together at Microsoft, we got to do all sorts of fun things with Sketch the Docs. And we can talk about that later on the show. One of the things I want to start our conversation with is, do you recall when you first came across tech, or when you came across just this concept of technology and how it can better yourself and better the world?
There's a whole story behind this, but that's where I started. But I didn't think of it as a career. It was just like, hey, I'm playing games and you're teaching me something done. My first career job, believe it or not, and this is again going to be a funny story because this was after engineering. My undergrad was in electronics engineering, believe it or not. And I did this in India. You might know of this tiny company called Infosys.
Sure. Yeah, I know. I know
Yeah, right.
Infosys.
So here, and I'm going to put my mom on notice for this. But so basically, I finished my undergrad, and Infosys was literally a small company in a garage at the time. And they came to all the local universities for interviews. I was the only one from my university who got picked in the first round, right? So I got a job with them. But my mom had the longest time, was like, these things don't go nowhere. You're going to study because women need to be like, studying and get ahead. This is not going to go anywhere. So I worked in Infosys for a year. I was employee 52. And then I left to do a PhD.
Okay.
And I'm putting my mom on notice. So, but anyway, that was my first introduction to coding for a living, was when I worked there.
That's that's great. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I think uh, with that, it seems like obviously, you talked about getting your PhD, right? I think that's something that's very interesting to me because I don't think a lot of people that are, I guess, developers by day or technologists by day, most of them aren't don't have PhDs. So
Mhm.
I guess one of the things I'm curious is like, do you use some of the tools that you learned when you were getting your PhD? Do you use it in your day to day?
So I will put this as a yes and no. So the PhD is broken into two parts. And if you want my advice, if you're going for a PhD, I would say take a gap year. It's very important. In retrospect, I wish I'd taken a gap year before I jumped into it.
Sure.
But when I say it comes things, because there are two parts of PhD. There is the process of a PhD, which is rigorous research and looking for open-ended solutions and finding ways to solve problems that haven't been seen before, right? And like proving them out. That the process by which you do that, the way you think through things, those come in handy always. The actual topic I did my PhD on got me my first job. I never used it again.
So, but I mean, at least you get to say that you're a doctor, right? Like I guess that's I guess that's the ultimate perk of having a PhD is that people have to refer to you as doctor if you want them to, right?
That is true. But no, I actually will say that the best thing about a PhD is it makes you think outside the box. And the second best thing out of my PhD was my advisor introduced me to Neil Stephenson's books. Like, we used to read random things. But if you're thinking today's PhD is maybe a bit different because to
Sure.
date myself again, my PhD was in Java. Like I literally had to build, we were doing transparent middleware that would bring fault tolerance to distributed Java systems, right? Today, that kind of has become a very low bar. You've got so many systems that do it that you don't need to think this through. So now you've got to really think beyond and like what's the new thing that you could do for performance optimization in an embedded system or something like that,
Sure.
right? But back in the day, the two things that PhDs give you, which anyone who's done one will tell you, is they give you a network. Like you
Yeah.
go to the research conferences, you get to know really high tier people. And when you're in the company of people who think big, you think big. You're not kind of looking at little details. You're thinking like, hey, let me chase this idea. And sometimes I even think like the stuff I do in visual storytelling comes from that mentality. Like I'm like, yeah, you may not see it now, but if I keep going and I keep going,
Yeah.
right, someday
Yeah.
you're gonna
Yeah.
see the value. And I think
It
that's what the PhD does. Yeah.
it's interesting. I mean, because at least when I think of PhDs, not just in computer science, but in any I guess practical sense, a lot of the it's a funnel to academia, right? Because you're thinking about topics that are so high level, and the research that's involved. And to be
Mhm.
completely honest, like you can be a great software developer. You don't even need any education really at all, right? Like you can learn it all
Yes.
yourself or go to a code camp or there are plenty of options to kind of getting into technology now. But I think one of the things that I think is very interesting to your point is like this extension of learning, right?
Mhm.
Extension of learning, not just for yourself, but for others. So,
Yes.
I think one of the things that I appreciate, from knowing you and working with you is like you have like this overarching goal to want to like continue to educate everybody, right? Regardless of where they are. And do you
Yes.
think that kind of comes from kind of being in that, going through that PhD practicum and kind of, extending how we educate ourselves?
Yes. And I want to just reinforce one thing you said. To be in tech, you don't need to have a degree. You
Yep.
need to have two things. You need to have persistence and you need to have a problem to solve where you can doggedly get there. And of course, let's be honest, you need a bit of luck and a good network to get
Yeah.
ahead. But I'm just saying that from a learning technology perspective, there's so many resources online, so many ways to get there. You just need a supportive community. But to come back to your question, absolutely. The biggest thing the PhD taught me is that you need learning is a process, right? Learning is a process of experimenting, failing, and learning that even failures have something that they teach you. So
Yeah.
you kind of keep going. I almost think of it like a Roomba, right? Research is like a Roomba. You're a Roomba. You go in a room, you keep going till you hit a wall. Then you're like, oh, I
Sure.
hit a wall. I should remember not to go down there, turn it. And then you slowly map out the room. And now you know
Yeah.
where you are. And now you know where you should go when you want something done. But I think the biggest value, and I'm going to keep connecting back to the visual storytelling stuff because it's important to me that
Yep.
people see that connection. What a PhD teaches you is to look for solutions outside your expertise.
Yes.
So a friend I know, for example, did a PhD in AI and machine learning, but got inspiration from thermodynamics. So you take ideas from another field and apply it to something you're doing, and it's new, but the science is the
Yeah.
same. And so that kind of make connections across domains and across disciplines, I think is super important. That's what the PhD gives you.
Yeah, I keep coming back to this thing. It's like, it's our responsibility as the current generation and this kind of goes outside of tech, but like our current generation, like our responsibility should be to educate the next generation about all the things that we did really poorly, right?
Yes.
So like, for instance, just as something as simple as we talked about it a second ago, like, 10, 15 years ago, if you want to get a job as a software developer, you had to go to four-year university, you had to do an internship, you had to do all these things, right? And now that's not required. Like, sure, some companies think it's very important, but a lot of big companies are seeing that no, it's not something that's super important or something that's required to be successful in this field. I think, you mentioned a couple of things that are kind of required. I add one more thing, and it's like a tolerance for pain or like having a bit of masochism in their bones, right? Like this
Yes.
concept of like constantly failing and
Hmm.
eventually getting to the solution, because that's the solution is what keeps everybody going. You talk to any developer and they're like, yeah, if the second I see the things work, is that's it does it for me every single time. So I mean, it's it's a lot of pain for for just a small amount of pleasure, right?
Oh my God, yeah. So to that point, I will say that I do a lot of tech talks, but I also do a lot of like non-tech or soft skill talks, if you will. And the two biggest ones I always want to do are one on why you should do public speaking no matter what. And
Sure.
the other one is on self-care. I'm going to now, based on what we just talked about, I'm going to make that into a self-preservation and then self-care. Because
Okay.
I think in tech, one of the things you've got to do is remember that, you're your first startup. You are customer zero for yourself.
Sure.
And too often, I mean, very like I burned out many times. You will burn out again and again and again in tech. I mean, I burnt out
Yep.
like last year too. And the thing is that you have to find ways to get yourself out. And the kind of thing that I had this epiphany on, and this was like 2016, that was the very first time I really had a massive burnout. I took
Sure.
2 months off doing all the stuff to get my head back in shape. And I kind of have this analogy around this. I've done talks on self-care, but the biggest thing I took away is in tech, our problem is we look for peer approval a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
We look for other people to approve of us, and totally like I think that's the worst thing about social media is it gets you into this cycle of how many likes, how many, right?
Sure.
And to break yourself out and learn to like do things that you like is very, very hard.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton there. I think everybody, you know, you can even, it goes outside of tech too. Like people need like, and that's not people don't need people. There's a lot of people out there that feel they need some sort of admiration or some sort of um, respect in their community
Hmm.
of choice, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you use like the Twitter followers and the retweets and the likes and things like that, and that's just a microcosm of. I feel like, if you go back, if you talk about anthropology, like we were in these groups of like 150 people, thousands and thousands and millions of years ago, right? We were in these
Right.
small pods of people, and we got the complete loop of our experience from those 150 people, and it was a community and it was whatever, right?
Hmm.
Now, communities are dispersed that are substantially larger, but we're still looking for like that 150 pod, right?
Yes.
So we're constantly out there like, okay, where are my people? Where are my people? How do I find my people? And
Hmm.
over time, at least in my opinion, has turned into, okay, well, I have to be visible. I have to amplify myself. I have to uh, find my people by any means necessary. And sure, not a lot of
Yeah.
people subscribe to that. A lot of people are totally fine just being with themselves or with the small amount of people that they interact with. But predominantly, like social media has shown that like we're all searching for all of our people, and sometimes it's in unhealthy ways.
Yeah. We're all searching for connection. We're all searching for purpose. And we're all searching for someone to say, I see you and you matter, right?
Sure.
But I'll actually, if this is interesting to you, because I hear imposter syndrome and all this stuff, right?
Yep.
Have I ever told you my Smithsonian analogy? And I'm going to use lots of metaphors and analogies because I love that stuff. I
Sure.
think it
That's totally
translates
fine.
well. Okay, have I told you about my Smithsonian analogy
Possibly, but
to learning?
let's tell everybody here.
All right. So I always start this, and I use this even with my son, right? So it's this. I've been in tech for like over 2 decades now, and but if you come to me, like literally, someone told me you're the Indian girl who draws. That was the way I was described once, and
Sure.
I was like, wow, okay,
Okay.
that was like reducing me to like one thing, right? And initially, there is this shock thing of wait, I'm a PhD, I'm a parent, I've got X
Yeah.
zillion patents, I've got right, and you're like reducing me to this. And then I realized that that's kind of where the Smithsonian analogy comes from. And it is this. Do you know that Smithsonian is this institution that has a whole bunch of galleries in Washington, D.C.? Do
Yes.
you know what percentage of the Smithsonian's actual artifacts are on display in those galleries at any given point in time?
I can
Any
only.
guesses?
It's very very small. I would imagine.
Yes,
Very very
less than
small.
2%.
Yes.
Less than 2%, right? And that's, to me, kind of like the metaphor I want you to use. We are all Smithsonians, which means that my years of experience are in this vault, right? That's giant. I've got a huge vault of experience. That is me. But what you're going to see is there are these galleries. You walk into the Air and Space Museum, you're going to think I'm an astronaut. You walk into the African History Museum, you're going to think I have like ancestry in Africa, right? So you come in and you see me through a sketchnoting session and you're like, oh, you're an artist. You come in and see me at a research presentation I gave to the ACM, you're like, oh, you're a distributed systems researcher. So the point of it is that my Smithsonian analogy is you have a Smithsonian vault. Never forget, never ever forget. Doesn't matter what people see, they don't see what you know. But you get to choose which galleries you're going to put on display, and in that gallery, which exhibit is live, right? So to me, I know I have to define myself in terms of 4 galleries. I'm a parent, I'm a polyglot, I'm a visual storyteller, and I'm a community builder. Those are my 4 galleries. And in those, I will choose to have one exhibit. Right now, my kid's going through like math stuff. So I'm like, okay, my exhibit is, this is what I'm going to do to help him learn, right? Or like we did stop motion animation, whatever. Visual storytelling. Oh, we're doing this thing for Ignite, or we're doing this thing with sketchnotes, or that's my exhibit. So in that sense, what I need to do is realize that when people walk into a gallery, they expect and see only that aspect of me, and that's okay. As long as they take away everything I know in that aspect, I'm okay. And then I have to nudge them towards, by the way, have you seen my sibling gallery next door? Do you want to walk in and go check that out?
Yeah.
And it takes trust to get there, but you'll get there. So that's my takeaway to anyone who's beginning, or anyone who's been here a long time and you kind of have this, oh my God, I'm never going to be good enough. No, whatever you've done, it's in your gallery and it'll come out. And I'm saying this not just for tech. Every experience you have in life, if you know how to pack a suitcase for a trip in under 24 hours, that's going to help you with compression algorithms for messaging down the line. So everything comes in handy. It's all in your gallery.
So I will just say, I'll say one thing about the Smithsonian analogy. It is so much better than the iceberg analogy that people also use for us for that similar thought, right? Like, you know, for people who don't know the iceberg analogy, it's like you only see 4% of the iceberg or whatever it is, right? And the rest of it is below the water and you don't see it, right? That analogy works, but also like nobody likes icebergs. Like that's probably not fair. There are probably some scientists out there that love icebergs and love to study them and things like that. But whenever you like, I can't speak for everybody, but for myself, when I think of icebergs, I think of terrible things happening to boats over 100 years ago.
You're going to think Titanic, and you're going to think that the icebergs are melting.
Yeah, exactly.
There's
right.
No way out of this one. Right.
But I think the Smithsonian analogy is great because it talks about, at least how I see it, is the layers of complexity that go into a person, right? You can be multiple things, and it's okay to be multiple things. If you want to be one thing, it's going to be very, very hard to be that one thing. Because I subscribe to the reason why people pay attention to, you know, very well-known figures in society is that they have these different levels of interest, right? Otherwise, people will get their fix and they'll move on to the next thing, right? So if you want to be sticky as an influencer, as a leader, you have to be able to show these different personas that speak to different audiences. And I think that's really, really important. You know, one of the things that you talked about is like community building, right? So what really, what I guess motivated you to get into community building? Because I know that you've built communities in the greater New York area for a while now.
Yeah, and actually, this again, you'll always hear metaphors from me. In fact, if I get a chance, remind me of the trees metaphor. But to answer your question, it all started. I have a kid who's going to turn 13 this month. Okay. I'll set this up for context because guess how long I've been in community? About 13 years. So there is a tie-in, and it is this. When my son was born, that's when I have what's called a commuter marriage. My husband works for IBM. I used to work in Motorola. I was in Chicago. He was in New York. It was an hour by flight. So we actually had because we're both career-driven people for the longest time. We're like, hopping around. And then he basically moved to Illinois for me, right? So we were there doing all stuff. I was doing a great career, moving fast. And then my son was born. And I was like, you know what? I want to change the way. I want to be there. Like, I want to be where he is. So we switched. So we moved to New York so that he would work local and I telecommuted. And that's actually the origin story for community. Because if you like today we don't think about it. In fact, it's been so interesting for me how pandemic has normalized remote work and
Yeah.
our entire way of dealing with it has changed. But this was like 13 years ago. It was not that way, right? You were
Sure.
a pariah. You were the
Yeah.
person we were
Yeah.
accommodating, right? So the reason I bring this up is I'm a person who bounces ideas off of people. I like to like walk into a room. I used to work in multidisciplinary teams. I miss that. I'm sitting in, and I made the choice, right? Nothing wrong with it. I made the choice I was going to be a remote worker. But I'm here with this tiny little squalling thing, which I love with all my heart, but it's not going to talk distributed systems to me. So I'm like, all right, I need to do something. And I started getting into this habit of going to New York. That's literally how I discovered meetups. And later on, when I had to switch roles out of Motorola, I kind of started going to web development. I'd been a mobile developer for the longest time, but web is where there was like a lot of growth. And it
Sure.
again was inspired by the fact that I'm like, hey, I want to go and attack my kids' school systems, and they only had desktops, right? So I need to be in the browser. I can't give you tablet stuff. So I started going to New York and I started learning Angular. And I was so fascinated with Angular. I thought Angular is the greatest language since slice, but oh my God, I can build custom, not custom elements of directives. But I was like, oh my
Sure.
God, my own custom name. But what happened is my kind of two things changed for me. First, my research in Motorola was on social search, like TV search and things like that. And I did a
Sure.
talk at the semantic search meetup. It was ridiculous. People came up and talked to me for hours, and I'm like, if you've been to research conferences, when a person walks up to a microphone, they're there to attack you and tell you how bad your idea is. That's literally how those go.
Okay.
Developer conferences, they're like, wow, this is so awesome. We love it. How can we use it? Can I help you? And I'm like, what is going on here, right? And I realized that communities are about people literally wanting to connect and help, right? They want to learn. And so when I started playing with Angular, I went and kind of did a talk at the Google meetup, and I was just learning, and it blew up. Like I actually went and looked at that talk recently. It's on SlideShare and has 100K views now. That was Angular 1, right?
Yeah.
And I realized that the way I explain stuff, right, is likely non-threatening because
Sure.
I really couldn't care less. I'm like, this is how it's going to work. But the second thing is, I kind of got so good at it that they asked me to become a co-organizer. And so I started becoming a co-organizer for Google Developer Group New York, the original one. And then it died. Don't ask lots of stuff. So when it died, like it had 5,000 members.
Yeah.
And they were like, would you like to start one? So I said, great, I'll start one. And I felt at that moment when it died, like literally, I went from having 5,000 people that I was building stuff for and talking to
Sure.
every day to being nothing.
Yeah.
And I felt that hole. And I'm like, I'm going to build this back up. So I built that community back to 7,000 plus in under 2 years. We were the fastest growing GDG in North America. And even now we're the second biggest one, right? But it taught me about a bunch of things. And this is the reason why community matters to me. I mean, like literally why I'm in developer relations, I kind of consider my like third or fourth career, is because I saw two things in community that made an impression. One, I was the founding organizer and kind of the organizer. I started one in Hudson Valley where I live as well. But me being a woman, organizing that stuff where I wouldn't take crap from anyone. Like when you're in my meetup, I'm here to protect my community. So if you're out of line, I will kick you out and I had no fear about it, right?
Sure.
What it helped with is that women were coming up to speak more. We did incredible events. I mean, there was a large run where I ran DefS NYC for 2 years. So we're getting a lot of people to come try out stuff. Some of the things that stuck with me, I ran Android study jams in Hudson Valley where I live. A woman, she had an MBA, had two kids, had dropped out from work because she had two kids. She had an MBA, remember? She dropped out. She
Yeah.
came back and she was like, okay, I'll start. I know, don't even know how to code, but let's work through this. In 8 weeks, she had actually built a very simple Android app that would teach her kids about animals. Just a photo with an animal's name and 3 stats, right? That's it. But it changed her. It was empowering her to say, look, I took a challenge and I did it. And I think that's what community means to me, is that it's representation, right?
Yeah.
I kind of standing up there, I realized it doesn't matter what other people think, because there's going to be one person in the room who looks at you and goes, I didn't know people like you existed. Now I think I could be there too. And I
Yeah.
think that kind of mattered to me. But then community will also burn you out. That's a bigger story. I'll tell you the tree analogy another time.
Yeah, I mean it's very true that community is all about getting people out of their comfort zones in safe ways, right? I think
Yes.
that's one of the things that's very interesting when I started going to meetups and speaking at conferences and all these sort of things is that I immediately found out like I'm probably not the best at this, but I enjoy it so much that I think my passion kind of, is sticky to people. Like
Mm-hmm.
I don't I don't enjoy the being up on stage and talking to people. I enjoy stepping off the stage and there's a line of people that want to talk to me. And that
Mm-hmm.
like and only because I might be able to give them some anecdotes or make some connections or what have you that can help them. And I think also like getting to kind of interact with that community of speakers and conference organizers, it really gives you some insight into how a lot of people kind of deal with this thing, right? Because there is a thought
Yes.
in tech in general, people are introverts, people are this, and speaking in public is not an introvert task. Introverts can do it, but
Yep.
you succeed better probably, or you succeed more comfortably if you're an extrovert. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that the one thing that's really interesting from all of that is that some people might not know that they can be a great public
Yep.
speaker or
Yes.
a great presenter or a great storyteller or whatever you want to call it. And there's different avenues, right? I think
Yep.
and I like to talk about Sketch the Docs in going into this because for folks that don't know, Nitya does this great thing called Sketch the Docs, where she'll actually take a concept and draw it, right there. And I'll post some links to some of the stuff she's done. But it's about telling story. It's about telling stories in a way that might be accessible to different types of people, right? What got you
Mm-hmm.
really interested in Sketch the Docs or this concept of, illustrations for
Visualize.
more, yeah, visualizations of concepts?
Okay, so first thing is you can go to twitter.com/sketchthedocs, and that account is only sketches. So you can go check it out to get a sense of what that is. Um, to be honest, like that concept started from something called sketchnoting, which I've been doing for years. In fact, if you go back and look at like when I used to go to big conferences, and oh yeah, I'll actually tell you the story that I always tell people. It started as self-care for me. This whole sketching thing I do started as a self-care mechanism because I used to get really anxious at big conferences. There are 3,000 people, you don't know anyone.
Yes.
Women were not necessarily in the majority, and you're sitting there surrounded, and you're like, I came here, paid money, or my company sent me, and I need to make sense of what this is, right? So I always took notes. I'm always like a note taker. In fact, you can't see it, but there's tons of written docs around me.
Sure.
And I started a sketchnoting, and then sharing it on Twitter, right? And it immediately solved two problems. I was there to learn. I didn't want to be anxious. As long as I'm looking down and drawing, I didn't know it was a self-care strategy. But then I would share it. And when I shared it, people would come to me like, oh my God, were you the one who just shared this?
Yeah.
We loved it, blah, 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 right? But what happened is it solved the second problem, which is I didn't feel alone because now people are networking with me. And this is the most important thing I tell everyone, right? They networked with me for the right reasons because they read in something I wrote, something that resonated with how they saw the same concept. And that was
Yes.
important. So that's where I started. But where it is now, it kind of like when I came to Microsoft, I was doing this just for the heck of it, right? So I used to go
Yep.
for Create Startups. I was a developer PM at the time. And I would like sketch note our own advocate stuff and put it out there just to publicize it. And then
Mm-hmm.
it became a thing. And then the pandemic happened. And I think that was the transformational point. The pandemic happened. Microsoft Build went from physical event to digital event in
Yep.
under what, 5 weeks? I forget.
Yeah, it was a very
And
short
they were
amount of
like,
time.
yeah, they were like, we have community sessions. Nitya, do you want to learn, do one on sketchnoting? And I was like, yeah, sure, why not? In fact, if you go search Twitter for hashtag MSBuild, hash sketch the docs, you will see a whole ton of people who
Yep.
posted sketch notes from that session, okay? It was hilarious to me because I made up that talk on the spur of the moment to
Sure.
teach people how to sketchnote. And it was super thing. And then I was like, okay, this is interesting. And then a cloud guru, they basically said, they said, do you have any articles on Azure that you'd like to publish? And I said, hey, I have a sketch note on cloud fundamentals. Would you like to see it? And we published it in there and it blew up. And I was like, wait, people like this? And those were the two things. And the statistic I always say is 65% of us are visual learners.
Sure.
65%. That means 2 out of 3 people that you meet can absorb things visually, right?
Yep.
And the sketch note, what I call visual guides, they're on a single sheet of paper and they address the fact that of those, like 33% are visual spatial learners. And I fall under that category.
Yeah.
That means that before you can teach me something, you need to show me the big picture. Like if I just see page after page of docs, I don't linearly follow things. I need
Yeah.
to have a map in my head, and then I can go in and I'll be like, okay, I'll be making connections. And I realize there are more people like me. So Sketch the Docs is really about how do I visualize concepts to you to help you learn. And so you can think of it as a, like a pre-read before you do something. So you'll see most of them are connected to a learning path, or they're connected to a docs series, or they're connected to a Minecraft lesson even.
Sure.
And what they're doing is they're taking something which has tons and tons of content items, summarizing it in one giant sheet. And it's pretty and it's colorful. And one tip I'll tell you is that I found out later that you'll see nowadays in my more recent ones, you see little stick figures. It turns out that when you draw stick figures having a conversation, people start putting themselves into the feet of one of those figures.
Yeah.
So when you give them just pages and say, here's how this works, they don't. But if you see one character going, I don't know how to build a web app, and the other one saying, well, why don't you look at Blazor? They're like, either they think to themselves, I'm the person saying, look at Blazor, or they think to themselves, I'm the person saying, how do I build a web app, right?
Yeah.
And that makes a difference because you hook them into the story of follow this character through this path. So anyway, now I'm exploring a whole bunch of different things. And in fact, that's why shameless plug is if you're at Ignite, go check out a session that I'm doing with the Azure Percept PM. It's going to be yet another way we're going to try to bring visual storytelling, and it's going to be interesting. Hopefully you'll like it. But yeah, it's kind of taken off a life of its own. You've also seen ABC, right? So that's also one
Yeah.
aspect of visual storytelling. Yeah.
I mean, you said something that I think it resonates very well with me. Like how many times have I heard from somebody, like I'm having a conversation, I don't specifically need visuals. Like I'm able to
Mhm.
kind of talk about things just with my words, and people will say, well, I need to know what that looks like. Like how many times in our careers have we ran across somebody that's like, I can't visualize this. I can't, I like, I need a UI, or I need some interface of some sort to understand what you're trying to get across, right? And it's insane to me how we've gone this far in tech without it like really being something that's almost a requirement, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Like,
Yep.
we've gone so far with technology that with people just kind of being forced to learn concepts with that don't work well when they don't know, when they can't see the visuals of a particular concept, right? Because
Yep.
I mean, sketchnoting is something that it's been around for a long time. Like the idea of creating infographics has been around for a very long time, but it wasn't something that you would see consistently in this space. And
Yep.
I've always, over the last few months, talking with you about Sketch the Docs and just in general, seeing that people respond so well to visualizations of things, I just think, why is it taking this long for this to be like a thing? Like, what are some of the things that you might think that's kind of one of the things that kind of prevented it from being so important?
That's an excellent, excellent question. And there are two answers. One, the more important answer is accessibility. And I really, really want to
Yeah.
dive into that a lot because that's one challenge I'm on my kind of like the war path on trying to fix. But the other thing is, to some extent, it's a strength and a weakness. The value of sketch notes, because when you think about visualizations, infographics could be like computer generated infographics. What's the
Yeah.
difference between that and sketchnoting? Sketchnoting is about an individual's perspective,
Yes.
and it's handwritten, it's hand drawn, it doesn't look very like, polished. And there's something very cool about that. It's like you feel like there are flaws. I can relate to this, right? But what happens is, in order for that to take on a life of its own, we need more people sketchnoting. And from that, so the counter to Sketch the Docs is a series called Visualize IT, or Visualize It, that I do, which is to teach people to sketch, right? So it's learn
Sure.
to sketch is Visualize It, and Sketch the Docs is sketch to learn. Those are the two sides. On this side, the big problem is people are like, I don't know how to draw. My handwriting is awful. I can't do it. I can't do it. I
Sure.
can't do it. And so because of that, it's never going to scale enough because there's so few people who doggedly keep doing this. So
Yep.
one of my goals to address that challenge is get more people to say draw. So like every time I do one of my sketchnoting 101 talks, I'm like, publish it. People are going to they're going to like it. I'm telling you. And once they publish the first one, people get on board. But now let's come to the sketch to learn and the sketch the docs thing. Biggest challenge is accessibility.
Yeah.
My highlight last year, or like highlight last year, was it last year? Yeah, last year was, or is it earlier this year? It was this year, was when the Azure Data Factory PM actually got the sketch note. The visual guide to Azure Data Factory is part of our docs. It's on that page now.
Sure.
That was a huge deal for me because accessibility is something we take very seriously. Anything you put on there should be accessible to everyone, and something that's visual by default does not lend itself easily to people who might have a visual impairment, right?
Sure.
And so one of the challenges that I'm working on there is, and again, the Ignite session is going to be an interesting way to address that, is looking for ways around it. There are two things I'm going to try this year. One I call visually, which is actually visual with the last thing spelled ALLY, accessibility. And what I'm trying there is we have this technology called Lobe.ai, right? Which is basically no-code training of computer vision models.
Sure.
So I've had it trained on some of my sketch notes. So now if you just raise a camera to a sketch note, any part of it from any distance, that's where I want to get to. It should immediately tell me what sketch note that is.
Yeah.
So if someone can, if it can recognize it, and then the second part is to give alternative content, have audio tracks, have a transcript, whatever that describes it, then we make it accessible. But that's the biggest challenge. That said, I do have like a hack I'm going to hope to push, which is, what my dream for sketchnoting would be, or like my visual storytelling dream would be. When you're on PowerPoint, when you get to add an image, it'll allow you to pick up clip art or stock images.
Yeah.
My dream is that we have a sketch notes tab in there, and people are allowed to contribute sketch notes. So if I'm building a deck on explaining Azure Data Factory, if I go into sketch notes as a tab and it shows me the visual guides people have drawn that explain Azure Data Factory, pull it into my presentation, I think that would be transformational. So anyway, those are the three challenges. People don't draw. It's not accessible. Scaling it for usage is hard. So, these are three ways to go.
Yeah, I think, and this is coming from somebody who's not very artistic, but I see so many similarities between solving problems in tech and being creative with art, right? There are tons of like, if you were to do a Venn diagram of both, there'd be a very large subsection in the middle, right? I don't understand. I think you see that, like, a lot of technical people, they play music or maybe they draw. I'm not one of those people. I play guitar, but not very well. But it's very interesting that you would see people not want to go forward with sketching the docs because of a lot of reasons. I think probably a lot of it is like, I don't want to mess up. And then like, once I mess up once, it's basically turtles all the way down, right?
Yep.
And I'd imagine, like, when you first started getting into this idea, this sketch note idea, is that I've seen you do it. Like, you're pretty perfect when you do it, right? Because I think it just comes with all the practice. I've seen you do it, Nitya, don't shake your head. I've seen you do it, and it's very, very good the first run through. And
you know what? I will show you chicken scratch. Here, what is this? Here's Blazor. This is literally what I was doing yesterday. This is chicken scratch, my friend. I was like writing this during so it's not that we're perfect. Anything looks good if you're slow, if you like do it slowly and do it enough. But yeah, I hear you.
I mean, I think your chicken scratch is like light years ahead of whatever my attempt would be. And I think a lot of that goes with, because one, like, you have practice in this space, and you're very methodical with how you do it, right? Like, and I think, and I've seen other people do it different ways. Like, they'll write down like key phrases that they're like, okay, I want this key phrase, and then I'm going to draw a little animation for this phrase. And then they itemize all their phrases, and then they kind of do the mapping after the fact. I've also seen some people, like, just similar to like sketching somebody on the subway, where like literally you draw boxes and things, and you draw words as fast as possible, and then when you go through your final version, you flesh everything out. Do you have a preferred method, which way that works best for you?
Yeah, and that goes back to my philosophy about sketchnoting, right? You need to know who your audience is and what you're trying to offer them. And I think the core, the very, very core to sketchnoting is that you must have a perspective. You don't need to know how to draw, but you must have something to say. If all you're doing is parroting whatever someone else has said, but you're not you didn't understand it, or you're not able to relate in a different way, then it's no different from giving them the original source. So
it's true.
The two things that help for me is, I think one, absolutely what you say, it is actually practice, but practice in a weird way, meaning that I've written notes all my life. So sidecar here is that, honest to God, this is true. I was one of those goody two shoes people in undergrad who never missed class. The
Sure.
entire class would bunk and I would still be in the labs. And so I had this reputation for being the person who would have the notes for every class, so much so that
Oh,
come exam season, my notes were like very popular. People would come and they would Xerox them. It was called Xeroxing. And
sure.
the hilarious thing is the local bookstore actually had bound copies of my notes because someone took and borrowed my book, made
Okay.
100 copies and put it in the bookstore for everyone to buy. I'm like, what? But my point is that it was part of growing up when you didn't have digital. Like now we take it for granted. You have computers everywhere. But growing up, like you took notes, you studied from like, analog things, right? So it was part of my makeup to always distill things down. And to this day, I have to write it. I don't even like I have piles of notes I'll never visit again, but I won't remember it until I write it once. It's almost like
Sure.
writing it down seems to solidify it, right? But in terms of techniques, what I have found is when I do paper and pen notes, I try to, and I say this even in the kind of visualize it workshops I do, is look for three things. One, know that the person who's doing the talk actually inadvertently is helping you because upfront they'll put an outline. You know what the big parts of the talk are going to be. Use that
Yeah.
outline to structure space, right? You know there's a beginning and an end, and there's a middle. Second, your biggest challenge is going to be time. So remember that the middle is never as important as the beginning and the end. You can
Sure.
leave big chunks of the
Sure.
middle out, but if you get the problem statement and you get the takeaway message right, you can fudge on the middle. So I invariably tell people, like I usually do my sketch notes almost like in a kind of circular
Sure.
fashion. When you get to the point that you're running out of space, stop until they get the takeaway message, put it in there. So that's two, right? That is like know your timing. Third, and this is the most important, any really good speaker will have takeaway messages that are filled with words or quotes that they will repeat again and again and again because they themselves know that in order to get something into your head, they need to reinforce it more than once, repetitive learning, right?
Yeah.
So listen before you write stuff down for someone to say it two or three times. Then you'll be like, aha, that's a key thing I need to write down and write it, right? And with that, your sketchnoting becomes simpler. So that's my rough notes. The digital ones, the visual guides you see are always done after the fact. When you, in fact, there's a very famous one for Create Data where I literally have the live version that I did and then the cleaned up version, and you'll see they're so different. The live version is chicken scratch, just like here's how it flows, blah 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 blah. Here's
Yeah.
everything. In fact, yesterday in Hello World, the visual notes I put down were taken live. It's chicken scratch, draw, chicken scratch, chicken scratch. When I clean it up, I look for three things again. One, put people and icons everywhere because it draws people's attention and color code them. So blues will be like developers, greens will be PMs, who knows, right? Put them in
Hmm.
there. Second is space them out. And third, and this is kind of like for the curriculum and stuff, is go big. I
Yeah.
nowadays I tend to make my canvases the size of 4K screens because when you have that space, then you don't worry. Like you can write slow, you can expand
Yeah.
out and like really build your content. Yeah. But it's essentially you start with the simple things. Don't have to get everything down. Just three things. There's a start, there's an end, and a middle. Save your time on the start and the end. Forget the middle. Look for the quotes.
So first, there's a lot there. I think the thing that I took out of it, which immediately caused an insane amount of enviousness, right? I've never been a great note taker. I've been the person who's like, it's in the head, and then if people need it out of that, I have to unwind it for people. Because my
Mhm.
note taking skills, I don't know what it is. I never like, I also never
I
studied
have
in
to disagree
college.
with you on this
Yeah,
because if you've been doing Azure tips and tricks, do you remember that series? Like the
yeah,
way you distill stuff, you just don't write it down. I'm sure you don't write it down, but
no,
you have this transcript which is effectively very, very summary driven. It's very easy
yeah.
to sketch.
And I think, and I guess my point being is that like going through the process of actually putting pen to paper has never been a skill of mine. Also, like honestly, like I never studied in college. Like there was many times where I would literally buy a book in wrapping and then return it to the bookstore at the end of the quarter in wrapping. Like I mean, I
In
just
there.
I have never been that person that would, hum and haw and take notes and, put bookmarks in and highlight stuff. I've never been that person. And so when you start talking about Sketch the Docs, I guess to me, it's like magic because getting things out of my head onto a piece of paper is very challenging for me. So for you to be able to do it like stream of consciousness in your ear, magic box in the brain, out your fingertips to a pen, to a piece of paper is like magic. And I think for a lot of people, that might be their initial thoughts too. But it's, the way you're making it sound is something that people could pick up in individual pieces, like your idea, like your concept you were talking about, beginning, middle, and end, right?
Hmm.
For folks that do presentations or tell stories in general, like there's always a beginning, a middle, and the end. And the middle is like, it's very important because that's where the meat is, but people don't remember the middle. They remember the beginning and the end, unless something crazy happens in the middle, like a
Yeah.
demo fails or a main character gets killed in a story or whatever, right? Like you'll remember
Yeah.
those moments, but at the end of the day, like if you watch a movie and you're like, "Oh, is it a good movie?" I didn't really like the ending, right? Like people
Yeah.
will immediately say the ending or like, "Oh, like it was too slow to start." So I couldn't get into it. Like nobody ever says like, "Oh, halfway through the movie like that was the best like the beginning like the middle of that movie was the best part of the movie I've ever seen, a movie I've ever seen." And it's very true about storytelling in general. And I guess I just had this epiphany having this conversation with you about everything has beginning, middle, and ends, right? Even
Yeah.
Sketch the Docs.
Yeah.
Even yeah,
You hit the nail on the head. There's a reason why I keep calling it visual storytelling. And it's just like a TV show. If you tune in and you miss the starting setup, you go in the middle, you're gonna be really frustrated. At the same time, if you watched all the way and you miss the last 10 minutes, you don't know how it ended, it's really frustrating. But if you're beginning and the end, if you know that, you're like, if I miss some part in the middle, it's okay.
sure.
I'm all caught up now. I find that with books too. And I think that is super important because I've also seen that good speakers, people who give good talks, they understand that storytelling strategy, right? They tend to pack middle stuff with a lot of details. Here's a walkthrough through code, etc. Like that'll take up the time, but they would always set it up with here's the outline of what I'm going to do. So if you take nothing away from this, here's what you need to know. Here are the three things you need to take away at the end.
Yeah.
And I say this because you know this too, right? Like these conferences are like fatigue on your mind. It's talk after talk after talk after
Yep.
talk. And you're like, I can't remember everything. So anyone who follows the storytelling structure, and this is why this visual storytelling to me is very good. I say this again and again, like when I ship a visual guide, I'll tell people it's not replacing the content. I
Yeah.
want you to see it as bookending it. Look at it before you start the learning path. It'll kind of prime your brain with the words, and your brain will kind of intuitively know the navigational path through the content. You don't need to absorb anything from this. Just scan it once, imprint your brain, then do the stuff. When you're finished, come back and bookend it again, because when you look at it the second time, now you've effectively seen that content twice already, right? The original recap and then now this through actually doing it. So now you'll only see the gaps. It's
Yeah.
amazing. I've done this myself. You'll only see the gaps. You'll be like, wait, I don't remember reading this part. Then you go back and you're like, oh, I missed it, or right. So the storytelling aspect is very, very important. And I say this all also as a parent. I've kind of found like with my son too. You want to explain something to a child and like explain like I'm five is a great example of this, right? You're
Yeah.
not going to give them a 45-minute lecture. You tell them a story, right?
Sure.
One of my famous examples for like one of my famous talks when I used to do a lot of stuff in that space was machine learning. My analogy was machine learning is like teaching a toddler. If you're a parent,
Yeah.
you know what machine learning is. It's literally that. Your
Yeah.
computer is a 2-year old, right? You're going to be like, example, example. Now tell me what this is. So if you can tell stories, you can teach anything.
Yeah, I think that's maybe where I fall down a little bit because I actually like going really into the weeds with my kids when they ask questions, and I think it's probably just like a strange like itch I need to scratch. Like I have a son who is very into science, right?
Mhm.
And we have conversations about all sorts of like ridiculous things. Like there's a funny story about we're at a party and there's an adult there and he's talking to this adult the difference between reflection and refraction of light. And he's like 4 at the time. And like the parent is or not the parent, the other adult that was there is like, I don't know what this kid is talking about. I'm like, he's all he's trying to do is just like connect with you the way he thinks that adults should like talk to each other.
Yes.
And it was very funny because they're like, but I don't know anything about. I'm like, but you just have to like listen to him and like feed off of the passion. And that's like the number one
Yeah.
thing about all of this community building and storytelling, all these things we've talked about is you can go to a presentation, or you can read a doc, or you can look at an infographic, and you might not know anything about the topic, but you're curious about it. If the person who's delivering this story to you is passionate about what they're doing, it
Mm-hmm.
immediately resonates with you, and you want to go that next step. And that's
Yes.
and that's my approach for when I do talks or present. I just want people to like leave like laughing and excited. And
Mm-hmm.
like when I was running, keynotes at Microsoft, like I just want people to like come out of these things excited to play with the stuff that we showed during the keynote. And
Yes.
that's it. Like I just want people to be excited about everything. And I think that's a fair thing to ask, right?
Oh, it's actually the most important thing. There's something I 1000% agree with you, and it comes even from conversations with my family, even for me right now, right? You've heard that thing which says you can take the horse to the water, but you can't make it
Sure.
drink.
Yeah.
To me, very important about learning is there is no way, it doesn't matter how good your conference, how many workshops you run, there is no way anyone is ever going to learn something sitting in a conference venue.
It's
Never.
true. It's very
All you
true.
can do is excite them enough and give them enough guidance. They're motivated to do it on their own, right? And so the one of the most important kind of like philosophies in my life is doesn't matter how many people love you and tell you that this is good or bad for you, until the day that you tell yourself I want to do this, it's not
Yeah.
going to happen. And so all we can do is give you more reasons to believe that you can do it, and then show you where to get started. That's it. More than that doesn't matter, right? And to go back to, I really love that you said your son loves science and that he likes these conversations.
Yeah.
And to me, I 1000% love talking to kids for that one reason. They are the most fearless things. They don't
Yeah.
even know what they don't know, and they don't care.
Nope.
And the reason I like the explain like I'm five is I actually think in tech, we look down on it, but it's the wrong way to look at it. Kids are very, very curious. And what
Mm-hmm.
I love about kids is when they explain stuff to you, they don't give you the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of
Nope.
the word. They will always use like. They were like, it's
Yep.
like this. And they will give you an example from their experience. And then you're like, wow, you understood that. Yeah, it's exactly like that. And then you're like, wow, oh my
Yeah.
God, you understood it. So
Yeah.
that's, I think, something we should take. Yeah,
Yeah. This same
absolutely.
this same kid is in soccer, right? And he doesn't. I won't say that he doesn't enjoy soccer. He doesn't like the game part of soccer. He likes the playing, he likes practicing, but he doesn't like the actual game part. I think he gets a bit overwhelmed. But he's sitting on the bench with his coach and he's talking about momentum with his coach. And his
Uh-huh.
coach comes up to me afterwards and she's like, he's talking about how the ball goes farther if people are running when they kick it versus staying when they kick it. And the reason why is because of the momentum of force. And she's like, I don't know how to have a conversation like that. I'm like, I mean, he's just telling you, he's trying to relate to you in a way that he's trying to understand why things are happening in a particular way. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's funny because it comes off as like all these things are very science oriented and all these things. And I think my kid loves to tell stories. I think all kids love to tell stories. But if you're able to
Yes.
have a successful story like that translates from a child having that conversation to an adult having that same conversation, it's really, really impactful for, the development of a kid's brain. At least that's my 2 cents.
Oh, you actually made 2 points here that I will reinforce. One comes from the community perspective, and it kind of run around to something you said. Huge shout out to community coaches, like all our kids'
Yeah.
sports teams and all those. I think they play a very, very critical role in building kids' self-esteem.
Yes.
If there's time, I'll tell a story about like my kids' basketball thing. But I think it's important that they actually promote kids thinking certain ways and reinforce behaviors, which is very, very important. I really, really appreciate that. And then the other thing is because you said science, and I think that's very, very important that we kind of have kids understand that science is about inquiry, right? So when my kid was growing up, I used to tell him all the time because I was very afraid about bullying, right? Like,
Sure.
there's a lot of stuff going on these days, and I'm like, okay, we live in an area that is where he was the only person of color for the longest time.
Yeah.
And so it was like, people are going to come say stuff to you, and I used to tell him, you need to think like a scientist. Like if
Sure.
someone says something, ask yourself, is that an opinion or is it fact? And if you can't show me with data that what they said is right, then you shouldn't be listening to it. So it's like, you're a scientist, think like a scientist, tell me where this is true, right? And that would make him question things they said. Because I found kids, this is the one problem with them. The first person to tell them something, they believe that is the fact, right? And then you have to work overtime to reverse it. And so I used to get into this problem where the teacher would feed them some stuff and I would be like, this is not right. This is not true. Like, doesn't apply.
Yeah.
Like, rethink this. And he's like, no, no, they said so. Like, no, you're going to question it.
Yeah.
Get the data. The first person you're going to believe is the person who shows you facts, right? Then go. And science, like, so I love that your kid loves science because it's going to kind of keep him safe.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's probably a lot like me in the sense that like science is the way that we make sense out of everything.
Yeah.
Like otherwise, like it's magic, and I think magic is cool, but like you can't have everything be magic because then you're like, okay, where do I get to institute control, right? And science
Yes.
allows you to institute control over things that you don't really know about, right?
Yep.
But that's a whole different conversation for a different day. So we're about to wrap up, and Nitya, I wanted to thank you for. I know, like it's funny, right? Like just rambling for an hour, and then it's like,
I know.
we're done. But I want to thank you for coming on the show and chatting with me about all sorts of things. I think, your passion for that helping that next generation of people feel empowered to learn is really insightful for me, and I really appreciate you coming on and chatting with me. When I end the show, I tend to like to ask my guests. So if you can think of, open source and technology and the community around it, where's the one word that comes to mind when you think of that?
Contribution.
Contribution.
I think the biggest thing we need to do is make people, oh no, I will even say psychological safety in contribution.
Sure.
I think that's the term, it's more than one word. But what I mean is that first step where you can get someone to contribute something to society, that's the hardest step. Somehow you can get them past that, then they're addicted. They'll do it again and again.
Yeah.
But we need more contributions because if we want to have it really be representative, we need people who never contributed to contribute. Whatever it takes, you got to trick them into it. You got to cajole them into it. You got to force them into it. But once they do that, they will be good. But contribution, we really need people to contribute.
That's great. I mean, I 100% agree. I have nothing more to add to that. So anyway, Nitya, again, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me just about your career in tech and all the things that you really find insightful. It was really valuable to me. So thank you. And thank you everybody for tuning in. This has been a great conversation and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day. Take care.